So, welcome everyone. We'll do the roll in a minute. Please see the notice of non-discrimination. Tegan, do we go over the guidelines, or I can't remember? It's been a couple of weeks.
It's worth restating briefly for new folks in the room. So do you want me to do it, or do you want to? Feel free.
Sure, go ahead, please.
Okay, so all of you should be joining us with muted microphones. If you can, please do rename yourself when you join the meeting to make sure we can see your first name and last name and an affiliation. If you're a board member, you can indicate as such. Please do not try to mute or unmute yourself. That will then require that you will be have to give permission to be unmuted again. If you do want to speak and participate in the discussion, there's a raise hand function. If you click on the participants button, that's typically at the bottom of the screen, and you bring up that window, then there's a raise hand button that you can then press. And then that will put you to the top of the participant list, and the chair can call on you as possible throughout the process. If you're on the phone, you can also sort of raise your hand by dialing *9. If you're a board member, when we do votes, please raise your hand to move you to the top of the list so it's easy to do roll calls. And then finally, if you experience any difficulties at all, technical or otherwise, please feel free to contact Roisin Foley. And you can do that through the chat box by emailing her at rfoley@ctps.org or calling 857-702-3704. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tegan. All right, I will read the accessibility statement. This means accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Roisin Foley, MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or 857-702-3704. All right, so we have introductions. So I assume Jonathan's on to read the roll. Is that correct?
Yes, I am.
All right, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and read the roll?
Okay. Mass DOT Chair.
Steve Wolfel here, representing Secretary and CEO of MassDOT, Stephanie Pollock.
Thank you. Mass DOT C2.
John Bishard, representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver.
Thank you. Mass DOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Great, thank you. MBTA. Okay. Massachusetts Port Authority.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore with the Massachusetts Port Authority.
Thank you. MAPC.
Hello, this is Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Great. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, present.
Great. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council here.
Great, thank you. City of Boston, BTD.
Tom Katz's, City of Boston, representing Mayor Martin Walsh. Good morning.
Okay, thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hello, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston.
Great, thank you. At-large City of Everett. I think Jay might be coming on now. We'll come back to him. At-large City of Newton.
David Kozis, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Great. At-large Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd, Town of Arlington and MPO area towns.
Great, thank you. At-large Town of Brookline.
Todd Corain, representing Brookline Select Board Chair Bernard Green.
Great, thank you. Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, Tom Bent, representing the City of Somerville, Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Inner Core.
Thank you. Magic, Town of Acton. Okay. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Yes, this is Erica Oliver Jerem representing Mayor Spicer for the city of Framingham.
Great, thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Hi, this is Darlene Nguyen representing Mayor Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Great, thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn. Okay. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland. Okay. Southwest Area Planning Council, Town of Medway. Okay. Three Rivers Commission, Norwood NRC.
Steve Olenoff representing Trick, Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go back to the at-large City of Everett. I think Mr. Monty's here.
Hi, Jay Monty, representing Mayor DeMaria, City of Everett.
Great, thank you. And I'll go to our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Did you get that? Ken Miller, Federal Highway. Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Federal Transit Administration. Okay, that calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
All right. As I said, welcome everyone. Next item is chair's report. I don't have much of a report, but I would just say, so folks know I'm going to be chairing until 11, then David will be hopping into the chair seat. So I'm going to take this opportunity for the chair's report because I will not be here for member items that for those folks who are not aware, Moving Together is happening. It's happening from November 17th, 18th, and 19th. We have both national and international speakers, which we kind of, that was the goal this year since we're going fully virtual. There's going to be a hard cap, probably, unlike what I usually do every year where we kind of fudge the cap. So if people are interested, please check out the agenda. Please register. Registration is free this year. And we're actually opening it up and sending out to more of a national audience. So please make sure if you're interested, don't wait till the last minute and do go ahead and register. So I just wanted to use the chair's report to let people know about that. All right, so next item on the agenda is Executive Director's report. Tegan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to step in just quickly first. I know Eric will speak about the elections later in the agenda, but first and foremost, I wanted to welcome new and returning board members and any new members of the public we have. But again, I'll let Eric speak to that more later. But just as a sort of a refresher, because we may have new people in the room, I use this executive director report time to sort of give you a few updates about major initiatives going on that staff are engaging in, give you an update on our outreach and communications that we're doing with stakeholders. That's a common theme that's very popular for the board, and then also give you some context about today's meeting and, if available, the upcoming meeting. So that's the goal for these reports for the moment. First, I will just say that we have become, or we are becoming, members of the Association of MPOs. I'm very excited about this. This is a national membership to support MPOs across the country and improving, of course, metro transportation systems. Staff attended the annual meeting last week, and I'm really looking forward to building a relationship and also the fact that it's an opportunity to connect with our national peers. So I'll look forward to how we evolve in that organization. And then I also wanted to give you an update on the CTPS Strategic Planning Initiative. And I'll again give a brief recap in case people aren't familiar. CTPS, which is the organization that staffs the Boston Region MPO, we've engaged a consultant to develop a 5-year strategic plan for us as an organization. We are staff to the MPO, but this is a bit different. We also engage in some other work to support regional stakeholders, and that can be funded by other sources. So while the board is very actively participating in the strategic plan, the idea is to complete this CTPS plan in advance of supporting the board in developing your operations plan for the MPO itself. And that was one of the recommendations in the federal certification review. It can get very confusing. And so if you have any questions or follow-up about clarifying the differences, I'm very happy to do so. And I just wanted to update the board that we have just completed an organizational assessment, which was a compilation of the feedback that many of you and other stakeholders and staff gave in focus groups and interviews about how you understand CTPS, what challenges and opportunities are for the organization. And it also included a high-level peer review of 10 MPOs in the country to sort of think about comparisons to how CTPS is structured, et cetera. And then from that, the consultants worked with the steering committee to create a universe of themes, which they're calling planning considerations, that came out of all of that work. And those will be the basis for diving deeper to develop the actual actions that are in the 5-year plan. So our next step is actually to do a retreat for the steering committee. And just as a reminder, the steering committee includes staff, but also board members, a federal ex officio partner, and others. And that retreat will involve looking again at sort of the vision, mission, and goals that are defined for the organization or around the organization, thinking about revising them if needed. And then also revising the themes that will be addressed in the strategic plan to start to hone in on what that's going to look like. So we're still about halfway through, but I thought it was, I wanted to acknowledge your work in supporting us in this effort so far, and that we still hope we're on track to have that process and the recommendations inform our budgeting process for the next fiscal year. So again, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions about where we are if you are curious, and otherwise we'll continue to share information. Then I want to jump to outreach highlights. Forgive me, I have a lot of stuff I feel like to talk about today. Since the last meeting, MPO staff hosted 2 information sessions on the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, to sort of try to make sure that folks had access to understanding the process and how to engage in it. And then also last week, we had a staff present at the Southern New England APA conference about how the MPO's project funding process supports municipal mobility goals. So it was a nice sort of awareness for the MPO's work. In terms of upcoming outreach, there's coming up really soon. Staff will be working with MPC, which hosts sub-regional meetings, and CTPS staff will join those to talk about the TIP and the UPWP opportunities that are out there to help engage sub-regional partners in those processes, and also hear and understand updates from those municipalities in the subregions. And then we will also be having the next meeting, I believe the 3rd meeting of the MPO supported transit working group, and that will be on November 12th. And at that, we will discuss the MBTA's Forging Ahead initiative, which we are also discussing here with the board. And if you're not familiar, that's the MBTA's process of developing a service package that will be appropriate for the next fiscal year, given the financial constraints as a result of the pandemic. We will also at that transit working group talk about the Community Connections program, and MEPC staff will talk about a new taxi livery partnership grant program. And we'll talk about our MPO transit technical assistance program. So for this and any other meeting coming up, it's all in the MPO calendar. Please go to the calendar. You can sign up for these meetings there. But this is just to give you a highlight to hopefully spark your interest in them. There's also going to be an information session coming up on November 16th about the Community Connections Investment Program, which is sort of a first last mile investment program. And then again, go to the calendar if you want to register for that. And then finally, I wanted to acknowledge that those Forging Ahead public meetings that are being held by the MBTA, it's not the MPO, those will begin next week, but as MPO staff, we're helping to try to share information about those meetings with our regional stakeholders. So while you should go to the MBTA and their website, you can find it easily by Googling Forging Ahead for information. We will try to share information about the meetings coming up to aid that participation. So those are all of my updates. I just wanted to highlight for the agenda today, we have 2 work scopes for approval. Again, one MPO funded and one non-MPO funded. The non-MPO funded ones come to you because MPO staff will be engaged in that work, and sort of you have an opportunity to discuss and approve that engagement if you choose. And then also we will have discussion as part of the performance-based planning work that you will be asked to endorse changes to the updated 2021 target about non-SOV travel in the Boston urbanized area. We talked about this back in September, And now we'll ask for a vote. And then also we'll ask for a vote related to the amendment for the disparate impact and disproportionate burden, or DIDB policy, which Betsy will talk about much more thoroughly than me. But we will present and discuss that amendment to you. Next meeting, I'll just say that we should have some more scopes. We will start off with a UPWP committee meeting, so hold that in your calendar for 9 a.m. before the MPO meeting. And then I just wanted to highlight two things. One is, I think next meeting we'll have a really interesting presentation for you on the MPO funded work to explore innovative ways to estimate trips when we have development or land use changes, and otherwise called, if you're familiar, trip generation rates. And we took a particular focus on how to better account for trips in our planning that people take by walking, by biking, and by taking transit. And then also we may be bringing to you the next TIP project universe to begin discussing what the next 5-year capital plan for the MPO is going to look like. So thank you for bearing with me. And please, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? Anyone have any questions? Okay, why don't we move to next agenda item? Next agenda item is agenda item 4, public comments. I believe we did get one comment. I'm not sure, Tegan, who's handling the public comment part. Is it that you, Jonathan, reading the one public comment we got so far?
No, that wasn't me, sir, Mr. Chair.
But did we? I thought I saw something or heard that we had one public.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. We had posted a letter on the website, but what will happen is that Betsy's actually going to speak to that letter in her presentation later on. So that was something about the DIDB policy. So thank you, and it will be addressed a little bit later. I think this is the time if anybody from the public wants to raise their hand to offer additional comments.
Yes, I think we have someone raising a hand from CLF. So,
yeah,
Mr. Epke, will you go ahead?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I am one of the authors of the comment letter that I believe is posted and will be discussed later, and just wanted to offer some brief oral comments in addition and provide some framing. And so I'll do that briefly. My name is Johannes Epke. I'm a staff attorney at Conservation Law Foundation in Boston, and the comment letter was regarding the agenda item 12, the DIDB policy. And the substance of the letter is regarding the consideration of negative values for the disparate impact threshold. And we are very thankful to CTPS for involving us in the stakeholder meetings and in the process generally. And this was the only issue that we identified as being of concern with this policy is the consideration of negative values is a way that this policy could address existing disproportionality. We far prefer the decision to use a negative or a zero value rather than a positive value, and ensure that disproportionality does not continue to expand. But this being such a robust and thoughtful, I don't know if I could go as far as to say a flagship policy in disparate impact and disproportionality, but the scope of the policy is very constrained in that it does not address existing disparate impacts. And we believe that a consideration of a negative value would help to lessen those existing equity issues over time, and strongly urge the board to consider that. And I won't read a portion of the letter in as I was planning to, as it is linked in the materials, and you can read through further our concerns and suggestions there. And we very much welcome ongoing conversation on this. I unfortunately might not be able to stay on. I have a conflict at 11:30, so I hope that I will be able to be present for discussion of that policy, and I will, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that would like to address the MPO today? All right, seeing none, we're on to agenda item 5, committee chairs report. Are there any reports from committee chairs? All right, seeing none on that, we're on to agenda item 6, the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Leonard? Is Leonard here, Jonathan? Do we know?
He is
he-
here. Oh,
He's
yep.
here. He did check in.
Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry about that. I thought I hit the unmute button and I didn't. Sorry about that. This will be short. So we had a really good meeting yesterday. Mike Baldock and Carrie Lavely from MassDOT came to talk with us about how projects or the cost is evaluated and also how they are scored with insights into how cost benefit analysis is done. It was a really good meeting. There's a lot of material that was presented. I encourage anyone that's interested in it to go and look at the recording. A lot of us who were at the meeting are going to go and look at the recording, but very insightful. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
All right, any question for Leonard? All right, seeing none, we're on to agenda item 7, MPO election results. Eric, I assume this is you. Oh, wait, John Bouchard raised his hand before we go to Eric. John, what's up?
I just wanted to make sure that that Leonard, the RTAC report, you said Carrie and Mike Bolduc participated in that meeting yesterday. They had reached out to me earlier in the week about some of the requests. I want to make sure that they addressed all your needs, and if there was anything specific on cost estimating and transportation projects that you needed a follow up on, that you can reach out to me and we can certainly schedule something in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And we'll take you up on it, especially with respect to costing. It's more of a curiosity thing than anything else to me. And so thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Leonard. Thanks, John. All right, so now we are on to election results. Eric.
Hi, good morning. Yes, Eric Barassa with MAPC. So this year we had 4 municipal seats on the MPO up for election. And we had 4 municipalities get in their nomination papers. And the seats were all unopposed. And so the final results were the city of Everett was reelected for the at-large city seat. The town of Medway was reelected for the Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, the SWAP seat. The city of Beverly was reelected for the North Shore Task Force seat. And this year, the town of Lexington did not run again for the at-large town seat, and the town of Brookline got their nominations in for that. And so the town of Brookline was elected for the at-large town seat. So those are the results of the MPO election. And we do have Brookline today joining us as a new member to the MPO, which is great. I know that back in the end of the spring, we had a conversation at the MPO about the MPO election process, which again is something that Federal Highway Administration highlighted in the MPO certification review about the lack of turnover and the lack of competitive races. And so it's something we still want to do a survey to the municipalities to learn more about people's perspectives on the MPO election process, why people either decide or not to run for it. We decided to hold on that survey because we started to do the actual new election process over the course of the summer, and we didn't want to confuse people with multiple things going out requesting people's information with respect to the MPO municipal election. So we are going to work on that survey and get that out sort of in the December, January timeline, myself and Brian Kane working with the MPO staff on that. So I just want people to know we didn't forget about that, but we didn't want to confuse people with too many asks, since the entire municipal election process, both the nominations and the eventually voting, was all done electronically and virtually, which I think worked pretty well. And I think it's something we can think about doing moving forward, just because of the challenges with paper balloting, but that's something we can discuss at a future time. And so that is the results of the election. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, any questions for Eric? I don't see any, so last
Yeah.
call. Are there any questions? Do you see any, Eric? I don't see any, Eric, so I think we're good.
So if there aren't, I just want to thank Brian and the MBTA Advisory Board for their support in this effort. And we do this jointly, both MAPC and the MBTA Advisory Board. And I really also want to thank the MPO staff, particularly Kate White, Rasheen Foley, Jonathan Church, for all their help also in helping to get the communications out and helping with the development of the election materials.
Eric, it looks like we do have one person raised their hand. Daniel, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Eric, for the report. My one curiosity question is, did any other communities express interest in running and then decide not to run?
Yeah, so for the at-large town seat, the town of Wakefield actually did submit materials pretty much at the last minute, but they did not fill them out correctly. And I did speak with the town administrator in Wakefield, and I explained to them what they, what went wrong, and they were totally fine. And I said we will work with them next year if they're interested in running for one of the open seats, either North Suburban or the other at-large town seat, and have a conversation at that point. And they were totally fine with that. We'd heard a little interest from a couple of other communities, but nothing materialized. It was really only Wakefield that actually submitted nominations, but they did not have the appropriate mayors and other chairs of select boards on the nomination forms.
All right, thank you.
So I see that two people have their hand raised. I don't know if it's to be let in or to actually have questions. So I don't know who they are. So does someone have their hand raised to ask Eric a question?
I see Ken.
Ken, all right, go ahead, Ken.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Eric. That was very helpful, and I look forward to what you guys find out moving forward with the data collection effort. Just one question. Can you tell us how many communities actually voted or participated in the election?
So there were 15 municipalities, and I have to go back and check again, but there were 15 municipalities as of this morning that voted electronically. And so I think that is something that we need to look into in terms of why did we have a lower rate this year. I think it's probably because we didn't have the event at the MAPC Fall Council meeting, where we tend to have a lot of people getting together anyways. And so that's something we do need to explore, because traditionally we have closer to 45, 50 municipalities voting. So we did have a lower turnout this time around. I had heard from a few people saying that they had not received notice. And I think sometimes what happens is it is not the mayors or the select board chairs who actually hear about the election process. It's staff and it's other municipal planners or people who are involved in the MPO that then make sure that those chief elected officials are aware of the election. And we might have missed that by sending a lot of the communications directly to those chief elected officials. I did also highlight for people that the elections were unopposed. And so I don't know if that also
so that had an effect
had an effect where people were then less interested in filling out a form if they felt like it didn't actually matter.
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Anyone else have any questions for Eric? All right, I think that's it. Thanks, Eric. We will move on to agenda item 8 now, which is an action item, approval of the MPO meeting minutes of September 17, 2020. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes? And please remember to identify yourself and what organization you're with.
Eric Barrasso with MAPC. I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, seconds the motion.
All right, any questions or comments or changes to the September 17th minutes? All right, seeing none, Jonathan, can you read the roll?
Will do. Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard, we can come back. John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
thank you. Ryan Kane,
Kane, yes.
Tom Katzis,
Kansas, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Carrain,
Todd Corain, abstain.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Erica Jerem,
On behalf of Thatcher Keyser and the city of Framingham, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Here, Darlene Wynn, City of Beverly, yes.
I believe Jennifer Constable is now here from Town of Rockland.
Jen Constable, yes. Thank you.
Steve Olenoff,
Steve Olenoff, yes.
I believe the motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, everyone.
I apologize. I think we may have missed Len Diggins.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I absolutely did. Leonard Diggins, my bad.
I know. It's because I'm so agreeable. Of course, yes.
Did you say yes? I'm sorry, my laugh got in the way.
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
right.
Now I believe the motion carries, Mr. Chair.
And we should also circle back to John Bouchard. I
John
believe.
Bouchard, he seems to be back. John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
Thank you. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jonathan. We're on to action item 8, agenda item 8, action item work scope Cape Rail study. I believe Ben's handling this. Ben Dowling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. My name is Ben Dowling. I work in the Transportation Systems Analysis Group. CTPS, I'm here to talk about the work plan for the Cape Rail study. The client for this project is MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning. The project supervisors are Marty Milkovitz and myself. The funding source is a MassDOT SPR contract. The schedule for the project is 8 months after work commences, and the budget is $65,488. Briefly, the project is to study commuter rail service, full-time commuter rail service to the Cape. The proposal at this time is to, you can think of it as sort of making Cape Flyer service full-time permanent service. And the Cape Flyer, if you're not familiar, the Cape Flyer is seasonal commuter rail that runs to the Cape and uses the Middleborough line as its route. The project would be, it'll be consistent with the South Coast Rail Phase 1, which also would utilize the Middleborough commuter rail line. We are scoped to study 2 build alternatives, and we are scoped to attend 3 public meetings, which are going to be put on by the Cape Cod Commission and by MassDOT. And the exact definition of the build alternatives that we will be studying have not yet been solidified or haven't been specifically identified. But I believe in the agenda materials, there was a map circulated, and that map will give you an idea of just what the geographic scope of the study will be. And that's the project in a nutshell. If you have any questions, I can try to answer them.
All right. Anyone have any questions? Ryan, go ahead.
Thanks. Just a quick question. What was the funding source for this?
I believe Ben said it was SPR funds, Federal Highway SPR funds, correct, Ben?
That's correct.
Other questions? All right. Laura, go ahead.
So this one's interesting just because it's across MPO boundaries. And so I was just curious if you could say a little bit more about how you intend to work with the Cape Cod Commission on this.
So Ben, yeah, why don't you start? And if Ben Muller also wants to join in because he'll be our project manager, he can jump in too. Why don't you go first, Ben Dowling?
Too many Bens.
Yeah.
The Cape Cod Commission is a big participant in the project, and we are certainly going to work with them to shape the project. I mean, in terms of crossing MPO boundaries, I mean, CTPS will communicate freely with Cape Cod Commission. Maybe Ben Muller has something to add to that.
Sure. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Laura. The Cape Cod Commission is going to be undertaking the public process for this study, funded through the Cape Cod MPO's UPWP budget. So they are going to be staffing the advisory board for the public meetings, and it's through that board that we're going to be determining the build alternatives that we're interested in. Membership of that board also includes representatives from the towns of Wareham and Middleborough, which are in the Southeastern Mass MPO. And the representatives from those communities also sit on the Southeastern Mass MPO board. So there's a few different MPOs involved there, but we're trying to make sure that the advisory group's sort of the locus of decision-making about what build alternatives we're interested in pursuing.
Laura, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
All right, Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to, for our new member and for maybe other folks who may not be as familiar, SPR, Federal Highway provides two different kinds of planning funds. This is being funded by SPR, which stands for State Planning and Research Funding. This is funds that are allocated to each state. And MassDOT is choosing to then use some of their state funds to fund the study for the MPO. And they do that with other things. And we also provide what's called PL funding or planning funds, which can only be used for metropolitan planning. And so most of the activities of the MPO are funded by PL funds from Federal Highway, and also Federal Transit has planning funds, 5303 concept, and we do a combined planning grant each year now. So I just wanted to clarify that for those who may not be familiar. Thank you.
All right, other questions? All right, Brian, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to make the motion to approve. Did you hear me? I was going to make the motion to approve.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself.
Acceptable.
Yes, Brian, thank you for that. Can I get a second?
This is Daniel Amstutz. I second.
All right, any further questions? All right, Jonathan, can you read the roll?
Stephen Wolfle,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes, sir.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Erica Jerem,
Erica Jerem, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Steve Olenoff.
Steve Olenoff, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, everyone. All right, so on to next agenda item 10. It's an action item, work scope informing the big ideas. Kate White.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate White. I'm the Public Outreach Coordinator of the Boston Region MPO. I'm excited today to present to you the work scope for the federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP study, informing the big ideas behind the MPO scenario planning process. The length of the study is 8 months after we begin, and the budget is $20,695. So our objectives for this study are to support development of big picture questions to be explored through the MPO scenario planning by identifying through equitable and inclusive direct outreach, diverse perspectives on key regional transportation challenges and driving forces in the Boston region. Reviewing and incorporating public outreach data collected on regional transportation issues by other organizations and agencies, and identifying potential strategies to address these key challenges and incorporate all of this into our scenario planning. So as we all know, the transportation world is rapidly evolving, and we've heard that there is significant interest from stakeholders ranging from advocates to municipal partners about examining how some of the large-scale ongoing transportation trends, open policy questions, and possible developments could affect the MPO's work and the Boston region's transportation system in the upcoming years. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has transformed transportation behavior in the short term and could have long-lasting effects on how people move through the region. The Long Range Transportation Plan, or the LRTP, is the MPO's main vehicle for tackling long-term and large-scale regional transportation questions. And since this next LRTP is scheduled for completion in 2023, now is the time to develop the questions the LRTP scenario planning process will explore. So the information collected in this study will help the MPO develop plausible transportation futures that would be examined through the MPO scenario planning process. And possible scenario elements to discuss with stakeholders include transportation pricing, climate change and resiliency, work from home policies, and large-scale regional zoning and land use changes. Task 1 will be to review public outreach data on regional transportation priorities from other community organizations and agencies. Task 2 will be to conduct a variety of virtual focus groups and interviews with stakeholders representing municipalities, agencies, community organizations, chambers of commerce, and advocacy groups. And staff will target stakeholders who work at the intersection of mobility and the following issue areas. So public health, youth, housing, economic development, social issues and policy, environment, technology, and workforce development. And we will particularly target stakeholders who represent organizations that work with communities that face barriers to participating in civic life and therefore are often underrepresented in the planning process. And task 3 will be to produce an ArcGIS story map to showcase the themes and stories we heard, as well as present the findings to the MPO. So we recognize that conducting outreach is challenging at this time, However, the transportation challenges that the region faces means that understanding and responding to transportation concerns of the Boston region are more important than ever. So thank you so much. And does anyone have any comments or questions?
All right, before I turn to questions for Kate, can I get a motion and a second to approve this work scope? Eric?
I make the motion to approve this work scope.
Is there a second? I see a second person had a hand raised. Daniel, go ahead.
Daniel Amstutz, I second.
All right, any questions for Kate? Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for the overview. So my question is, in addition to outreach to various stakeholders, will you also be outreaching to some to the MBTA and connecting with MassDOT as well as municipalities in the region, also to kind of understand some of their, what they're thinking about in terms of things that are going to impact the region in the future that could be important as part of this scenario of development?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. We do plan to we've been already coordinating frequently with the MBTA and MassDOT. And also as staff, we plan to just really kind of stay tapped into everything that's going on with Forging Ahead. So we're just kind of making sure all those things are aligned. But we do want to keep everything in the loop, and we're also going to be attending the Metro Commons scenario planning workshops that are coming up in December to see what stakeholders are saying there.
Great, thank you.
All right, other questions for Kate? All right, seeing none. Jonathan, you want to read the roll?
Will do. Stephen Wolfel,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes. And don't forget Len this time.
No, I won't. Nope, I didn't last time. Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kansas.
Yes, Kansas.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Yes.
Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozas.
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain.
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
Erica Jerem. I will come back. Darlene Nguyen.
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Steve Olenoff.
Steve Olenoff, yes.
And I will go back to Erica Jerem.
Yes, Erica Jerem says yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Kate. I want to action my next action item, which is agenda item 11, revised target for the percent of non-SOV travel in the Boston represented area. Go ahead, Ben Muller.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. We can move on to the next slide here. So, good morning, everyone. So just a reminder, in September, we discussed MassDOT's proposed revision to the 4-year target for the percent of non-single occupancy vehicle travel, or SOV travel, in the Boston urbanized area, which stretches from Taunton up into New Hampshire. This target was set 2 years ago, and since then we have additional data showing that we're achieving progress in mode shift from SOVs at a faster rate than we initially projected. So per the terms of the Boston urbanized area memorandum, MassDOT develops a target for the urbanized area as a whole in consultation with the MPOs. And then we formally notify FHWA of any revisions to that target. Once we've completed that process, MassDOT then seeks formal support of the revision in the form of a vote of the MPO board. So that's where we are today. Next slide. So before we go into detail on this particular revised target, I just want to remind the MPO that this performance target is just one in a suite of federally required performance targets. You can find more information in the Boston MPO's tip in Chapter 4, which sort of describes them in great detail. Additionally, MassDOT has set some statewide targets that are independent of the federal performance targets, and those are available in our tracker report, which is updated annually at mass.tracker.com. Next slide. Yep. So this chart shows the data that has driven our decision to revise the performance targets. This is based off of the Journey to Work data from the American Community Survey from the US Census. So notably, this data does not cover, or it only covers work trips, so it doesn't include any trips made for recreation or for any other purposes. But because it does cover work trips, it does include telecommuting as a mode of travel. And then additionally, this is presented as 5-year rolling averages. So the solid dark blue line at the left shows the actual data that was reported by the American Community Survey. So up until 2016 is the data that we had available 2 years ago when we set the target. And then the lower dashed line shows our projection from then that we based our current four-year target on. And as you can see for the 2017 and 2018 data, the actual data came in a bit higher than our projection. So the higher dashed line at the right shows our new projection to the 4-year target date of 2021. So at right, you can see the lower red figure of 35.1% was our previous 4-year target. And then the higher figure of 35.8% is our revised 4-year target for the Boston urbanized area. It seems like a pretty minor difference, but that's nearly 20,000 commuters expected to shift to a non-single occupancy vehicle mode under this projection. So we thought it was significant enough to warrant revising the target. Next slide. So this just shows the other performance measures in this category of performance targets, which is congestion mitigation and air quality. We've not made any revisions to the other 2 targets listed here for this cycle for the Boston MPO region. We did make revisions to the last measure statewide. This is total emissions from CMAQ funded projects in non-attainment areas. For the Boston region, that only applies to the city of Waltham, for which there was no change. Next slide. And this slide just shows the upcoming schedule for performance targets coming before the Boston MPO. So we expect later in the fall or early winter to receive the transit safety targets and the transit asset management targets from the MBTA and MWRTA and CADA. As well as early 2021, MassDOT will be coming back with calendar year roadway safety targets, which are on an annual basis. Next slide. So MassDOT is requesting that the Boston Region MPO vote to support the revised 4-year target from 35.1% to 35.8%. Thank you.
All right, can I get a motion in a second to adopt the revised target? Eric?
Eric Barassa, MAPC, I make a motion to accept the revised target.
Okay, is there a second? Tom? Ben?
Tom Bent seconds that motion.
All right, any questions or comments for Ben? Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. Ben, thank you for this. That's been helpful. I just a question. So since the base information is based in effect on the journey to work information, as you mentioned, which typically is only about 1/3 travel, work-related travel is typically about 1/3. So, but this percentage, your target though, is for all travel. Is that correct?
I believe we're basing our target just on the commute travel.
I know you're developing it based on the commute travel, but the performance measure itself is supposed to be for all travel. Is that correct?
Oh, correct. Yeah, we just don't have data for all travel to sort of justifiably make a informed target yet, but we are working on that through, I believe, the Office of Sustainable Mobility is amping up their bike and pedestrian modeling and counting capabilities currently, although I don't know too much about that process personally.
Well, I would perhaps it would make sense to get some information from the model, because the model has and for anybody that staff correct me if I'm wrong, but the model can get occupancies and things and mode shares for different kinds of trip purposes. And then you could develop a relationship between this, the work travel and the non-work travel to see what would perhaps be a better target. I don't expect you to do anything right now for this round. I mean, that's fine. But moving forward, you might want to think about somehow using model results to get a better overall target rather than just have it based, sliding the work-based target, because typically work-based travel has much higher, a very different mode shares than others. And then also moving forward, and I know you can't account for this now, as more and more people are telecommuting, that will be shifting trip purposes dramatically, and also would have an effect on this, but I imagine you can't account for that right now. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ken. Anyone else? All right, Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and read the roll?
Steve Wolfel?
Yes. Oh, wait, never mind. I thought Darlene had a question, but I think people are starting to vote. Darlene, did you have a question, or were you just voting?
Just voting. Sorry for
Okay, go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, Steve, I have your yes vote. John Bouchard?
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano?
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore?
Yes.
Eric Barassa?
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane?
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins?
Rodriguez, yes.
Tom Kadzis?
Yes, Kansas.
Jim Fitzgerald?
Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty?
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis?
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz?
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Carrain?
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent?
Tom Benton, yes.
Erica Jerem?
Erica Jerem, yes.
Darlene Wynn?
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable?
Jennifer Constable, yes.
And Steve Olenoff.
Steve Olenoff, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ben. All right, we're on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 12. It's an action item, disparate impact metric study and final disparate impact and disproportionate burden policy. Go ahead, Betsy.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you, everybody, and good morning. So today I'm going to talk about the results of the disparate impact and disproportionate the disparate impact metric study that was completed in this past year. It was undertaken to support finalizing our disparate impact and disproportionate burden, or DIDB policy, for our long-range plan, which I'll ask for your endorsement of at the end of the presentation. I want to take a moment to just thank everybody who's participated. This has been a multi-year effort. Stakeholders, several of whom are on the MPO board, participated, and as well as several folks from advocacy groups, including, I might mention, the Conservation Law Foundation, as well as some folks from human service organizations. And their input was incredibly helpful and productive. And I want to thank them all for their participation. And staff from our agency, it was an agency-wide effort. So pretty much everybody on CNCTPS in some way contributed to this. So I may be giving the presentation, but it definitely was an agency-wide effort. So today's goals are to discuss the results of the disparate impact metrics study, to provide a summary of the development of the DIDB policy for our long-range plan, and to vote to endorse our final version of the DIDB policy. So through US DOT regulations that respond to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we are required to identify and address impacts that would disproportionately affect people because of their race, color, or national origin. And through the Environmental Justice Executive Order, we're also required to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse effects of our investments on people with low incomes and minority populations. Our DIDB policy will allow us to achieve both of those goals in a consistent and transparent manner by setting a series of 3 thresholds that must be passed in order for an impact to be considered disparate impact or disproportionate burden in the LRTP. These 3 thresholds will demonstrate first that the impact is caused by the projects that are proposed to be funded in the LRTP. Second, that the impact is significant enough to affect people's quality of life. And third, that the impact would disproportionately affect the minority or low-income population more than the non-minority or non-low-income population. And while the DIDB policy is a powerful tool, it is narrow in its scope, which limits its role in moving us toward an equitable transportation system. And that's why it's so important that we continue our work in doing effective outreach to vulnerable populations, and that our goals and objectives are clear and grounded in the realities of vulnerable communities, and that we're prioritizing the funding of projects that benefit these communities. So as many of you know, we've been working on developing this policy for several years now. Back in May of 2018, we held our first stakeholder meeting, which brought together MPO members, advocacy groups, and human service organizations. That year, we held 3 meetings, plus a public workshop to get initial input on how we should approach the policy, their priorities, and metrics that we should analyze, such as travel time and pollutant emissions. Out of those meetings came a couple of recommendations. This included developing measures of model baseline uncertainty to screen out impacts that would be statistically unlikely, to provide detailed model results in the upcoming LRTP, which at that time was Destination 2040, which we did, and to determine when an impact is significant and would affect people's quality of life, which is that second threshold that I mentioned a moment ago. In response to these recommendations, we undertook several activities following those meetings. In the winter of 2019, we identified baseline model uncertainty for the metrics that we plan to analyze in Destination 2040. And then in May, the board approved use of a draft DIDB policy that we used in Destination 2040 that incorporated that baseline model uncertainty measure and the third threshold, which is that disproportionality threshold, but not the second one that determines when impacts are significant. And to help us develop that one, we then decided to undertake this disparate impact metric study that started last October, a year ago. And as part of that, we did have a final meeting of the stakeholder group this past August to get feedback on our final recommendation for the DIDB policy before we brought it to you for your approval, which brings us to today. So I want to briefly describe what those 3 thresholds are in the DIDB policy, which will allow us to determine whether there may be disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens. The first, and all 3 of them have to be passed for each metric in order for there to be a disparate impact for that metric. The first threshold is the baseline uncertainty threshold, which tells us whether there would likely be an impact by accounting for the uncertainty that's inherent to model forecasting. The second threshold is the practical impact threshold, which tells us whether an impact would be significant enough to affect people's quality of life. And the third threshold is the disproportionality threshold, which tells us whether that minority or low-income population would be more adversely affected, whether by receiving fewer benefits or experiencing more burdens than the non-minority or non-low-income population. And this approach really reflects what the federal guidance tells us to do We need to identify impacts that are caused by our investments. We need to identify impacts that are significant, and we need to identify impacts that are disproportionately affecting low-income and minority populations. And so the draft policy included that was approved last May, that included the value for the first and third threshold, but not the second one, as we acknowledged that we had some more work to do to come up with that threshold. Which brings us to the disparate impact metrics study. So I'm going to talk about the results now. And this study largely came out of one of the recommendations from the working group back in 2018. And the goal of the study was to determine through a literature review if there was a compelling reason to set that threshold above 0%. Our central research question was, when is impact significant? For example, how much of an increase in, say, carbon monoxide emissions affects people's quality of life? So we did a literature review looking at different types of metrics that we ended up analyzing in Destination 2040. These included travel time metrics and congested vehicle miles traveled, accessibility metrics, which look at the number of jobs and other destinations reachable within a certain travel time, and carbon monoxide emissions. We didn't want the thresholds to be arbitrary, but we wanted them to be based on research that indicates when an impact affects people's quality of life. And so we did a comprehensive literature review of these metrics, but we didn't find any research that indicated when impacts on a large group of people or region adversely is significant. And research has been done, say, on impact of travel time or carbon monoxide emissions on individuals, but it doesn't appear that there's much out there to generalize those impacts out to a large group of people. And conceptually, one of the main challenges for doing that sort of research is that setting one value for a large group of people in a region necessarily ignores significant negative or positive impacts because it averages out all the outliers. We also encountered challenges regarding how the impacts are measured. We'd kind of hoped that carbon monoxide emissions would prove to be a fruitful area of research, given the extensive evidence of its impact on health. But we measure the carbon monoxide emissions in kilograms across TASs, while CO emissions our air quality standards are measured in volumes and are derived from point sources. And then for travel time metrics, we also found that the value of travel time depends on a lot of different variables, such as travel mode and income and congestion level and other variables. And to account for all of these really would slice and dice our metrics in a way that's not particularly helpful given their broad and regional nature. So in light of those things, we didn't find a compelling reason to set the value of the second threshold above 0. So in other words, if there isn't, say, an increase in travel time, and we're confident that that impact is likely to occur after taking into account model uncertainty, we would consider that impact significant and it would pass that threshold, second threshold. By setting it to 0, we are accounting for the variation in impacts across the region, asserting that it is more important that the MPO avoids increases in harmful impacts for areas that are already experiencing burdens. The other role of this study, which I'll get into in more detail in a moment, was to reconvene that stakeholder working group after finishing literature review and developing a draft final policy proposal. I'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to describe the final policy proposal that we would like you to consider. We think it is logical, and we think it balances the considerations of the MPO and stakeholders and is consistent with federal guidance. For that first threshold, the baseline uncertainty threshold, we want to set that at moderate uncertainty, as we think this reflects what we can expect from the model and the metrics that we analyze. The second threshold, the practical impact threshold, as I mentioned, we would like to set this at 0% as we didn't find compelling evidence that we should be setting this above 0. And then for the disproportionality thresholds, because we don't want to allow any difference between minority and non-minority populations and low-income and non-low-income populations, we would like to set that to 0 as well. So on to the stakeholder meeting in August. I presented that policy proposal that I just described to get final input before we asked for your endorsement. The stakeholders had opportunity to ask questions and discuss how the policy will be used, and to experiment with how different threshold values could affect the presence of disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens. And to help them do so, we, or I should say, Emily DeMonico, one of my staff members, created this DIDB tool to help users visualize the role of each threshold and allowed them to change each of the values. And there's a screenshot of that tool on the screen. If you're interested in playing around with it more, it's also posted to the calendar. There's a link there, and you can see for yourself what would happen if you use different values for each of the 3 thresholds. So stakeholders provided us a lot of really good feedback, as they normally do. They were generally supportive of our proposed policy and felt that we had incorporated their input and feedback from our previous meetings. Several folks also stated that they would prefer for us to err on the side of identifying impacts that may not actually be disparate, rather than having a situation where we're totally missing out on disparate impacts. There's a balance to be struck there, and generally folks wanted us to make sure that we were identifying all of our disparate impacts, even if there was a chance that we identified one that may not actually exist. Folks also thought it was important to balance DIDB findings with the fact that our projects that we want to fund do a lot of good outside of, or in addition to some of the equity considerations. And that's important to remember. And then the final point is something that I wanted to bring up, something that Johannes brought up just a little while ago, and it's something that's come up a lot as well throughout our throughout this whole process, the idea of addressing existing inequities in addition or within the DIDB policy. There was interest from some folks to use the DIDB policy to redress existing inequities, which is something that internally MPO staff, myself and others have discussed at length, and as well with MassDOT staff at OTP and the Office of Diversity and Civil Rights. And while we very strongly share the belief that the MPO can and should do what it can to address existing inequities, we don't feel the DIDB policy for a long-range plan is the tool that we should be doing that with. And I want to take a moment to explain why that's our stance. As written in FTA and FHWA regulations, the DIDB analysis that we're required to do has a very narrow scope. It asks us to look only at the looks at the disproportionately high and adverse effects of our future investments and does not refer to redressing existing inequities. It is meant, and the way that we like to use it is as a final check on the whole project design and selection process. That the design reflects the needs of the community in which it's located, and that the MPO selects projects that genuinely improve transportation outcomes for vulnerable and underserved populations. And the project selection process really is where this board has the most influence in redressing transportation equities by funding projects that do that. The TIP criteria updates that the board approved last month bring us a long way toward doing that. And the DIDB policy is at the end of that project selection process, making sure we didn't miss anything. And that's another reason why we do recommend setting those last 2 thresholds to 0%. I also think it's important to state that while equity is and will continue to be a priority for the MPO, there are other important transportation issues that the MPO has to address, like safety and climate change and maintenance of our assets, among others. We have to have the ability through project funding decisions to address these critical challenges, and doing so with an eye toward protecting our most vulnerable residents. And finally, I want to emphasize the importance of public engagement to helping us creating a more equitable transportation system. We staff take very seriously the input that we receive from folks, and as my colleagues can attest, it often affects the recommendations that we make to this board, whether it's our long-range plan needs assessment, the TIP criteria, or the DIDB stakeholder group. And we're in the midst of strategizing how we can build off the success of this group and improve engagement with our vulnerable population so that we continue this conversation that our stakeholders have initiated around opportunities for the MPO to address existing inequities. And I just want to kind of close on those statements by saying that I want to continue this conversation with folks, MPO board members and public and stakeholders, to make sure that we are doing what we can to address these really serious challenges that folks face in transportation outcomes. And with that in mind, I want to turn to the last slide and talk about how we use the DIDB policy in the context of the long range plan. So if we do have a finding of a disparate impact for at least one metric, staff will determine whether there is a substantial legitimate justification for implementing the program of projects as proposed, as we are required to do by federal regulations, and present the conclusion to the MPO board. Staff will also determine whether there are one or more alternatives to the group of projects that meet the same goals, but that have fewer disparate impacts. If there are, staff will present this alternative to the board, and any proposed alternatives will be subject to the same DIDB policy and analysis. Similarly, if the analysis indicates that there would be a disproportionate burden for at least one metric, we will recommend to the MPO board steps to take to avoid, minimize, or mitigate these impacts where practicable. And finally, if there are no disparate impacts or disproportionate burdens, the MPO does not need to take any action. For both disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens, alternatives may include a mixture of strategies to mitigate, minimize, or otherwise avoid these impacts. Because likely impacts are projected to occur 20 years into the future, these strategies will likely involve programming future TIP projects in order to mitigate disparate impacts. And the MPO may also use this policy during the development of our future long-range plans when conducting scenario planning or making decisions about project programming in order to avoid disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens prior to project selection. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions. And again, thank you everybody for all of your comments and participation in this process, and for our whole stakeholders and all to the public and the MPO board and staff. It's been quite a ride. So.
Thank you, Betsy. Are there questions from MPO members? Steve Olenoff.
Yes, can you address what CLF said, and particularly, I mean, it sounds like they're asking for a negative number on a threshold, and mathematically, how can there be a negative number? If you're setting something at 0, which means, as I understand it, any deviation from or any difference from what it would be for a regular population, a minority population versus a general population, then that would be something that needs to be considered. So how can that number be negative?
So when we're doing the analysis, we're comparing a change in impacts between two populations. And so mathematically, if it be a negative threshold, what we're basically saying that is we want the, say the minority population, the impact to them to be, to either be significantly more of a benefit than the non-minority population, or reducing the burden on them significantly. So it's kind of,
So does that make sense? It's an average of all the different kinds of impacts, is what you're saying?
It's an average. So if you're looking at carbon monoxide emissions, it's an average of all CO emissions across the MPO for each population group. And what is the change between our build and no build scenarios with regards to CO emissions? And if, say, they're both projected to get a benefit, a negative threshold would mean that we want to see a bigger benefit. It's not just a benefit, but a significantly bigger benefit for the minority or low income population.
So if you were to want to choose a negative number, how would you determine the size of that negative number?
That's something we'd have to kind of, it's the same process. It's a continuum. You're right. It's a 0. You can be 0 above or below. And we would just have to, similar process to what we've been doing, of kind of what makes the most sense and what we think is kind of what the MPO feels is the most appropriate approach based on research and kind of the stuff that we've learned in the past couple of years.
So essentially, when you set this at 0, you're saying any discrepancy, any difference between a minority population and the whole population is a matter to look at.
Right. So if we feel likely that an impact would be present because we're taking into account model uncertainty, then there would be a disparate impact or disproportionate burden. Correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Others? Leonard?
Yeah, thank you. So Betsy, can you go back to the slide that shows the uncertainty? It doesn't have the ranges, but just the ones that have like moderate uncertainty and 0 uncertainty for the
Sorry, this one?
Yeah, that one. So I just wanted to kind of just go over this again with you. I've gotten a little fuzzy, and then bring up what I think we thought was a good idea for the MPO to handle this. So the bands mean for these levels of uncertainty, as I recall, or can you actually tell me what the bands are for low and moderate high uncertainty?
So when we had to give you everyone else context, so when we had gone to, Len was in the stakeholder working group, and so when we brought that, show them that tool, that visualization of the threshold values, you could choose 3 different levels of uncertainty: low, moderate, high. And the reason that we did that was because we're updating some of the metrics that we're looking at for the next long range plan. We don't have specific values for those yet. We will have to rerun the process to come up with uncertainty values for each metric, because they differ for each metric. And that's another discussion. I'm interested to talk offline about it, but how that's done. But because of that, we felt we didn't want to like pin a particular number on for this particular threshold. I didn't think it would be helpful, but rather provide kind of a range or an approximation of what value that would be for low, medium, high. And so moderate was, I believe it was about 50%, and low was like 10%, and high was like 90%.
Right. And so then my issue was that, the moderate was fairly high, and I understood, based on what Betsy said, why that was the case. And I think, my conclusion was that we should just keep an eye on it. So whereas this would be part of the policy, that as the board, we would have the ability to keep an eye on when they do the analysis, and ask me for a tighter or less forgiving threshold, and as just a way to, just like an early warning, for us. So that's the point I wanted to make to the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Other questions or comments? Seeing none, this is an action item, so I need a motion and a second from MPO members to approve the policy as presented today. And when you make the motion or second, please state your name. Lynn Diggins.
After a number of years of hard work on this, I heartily make the motion to approve this policy.
Thank you, Lynn. Tom Katzis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to second Len's motion. Thank you.
Thank you. A motion having been made and seconded, please call the roll, John.
David Mueller,
Yes.
John Bouchard. I know he was having audio issues earlier, so I can come back to him. John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore.
Yes.
Eric Barassa. We'll come back. Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Katzis,
Katzis, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Hey, Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Benton, yes.
Erica Jerem,
Erica Jerem, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Steve Olenoff,
Steve Olenoff, yes.
and I will go back to John Bouchard.
Jonathan, I believe John has left the meeting as well as Eric.
Okay, motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just want to take a second to say to Betsy and the staff who worked on this, this is really good work. You should be really proud of all you've done, both the outreach and the actual policy. So excellent job, guys. I'm sure the MPO shares that opinion. Next item is member items. Are there any member items come before the board today? Seeing and hearing none, can I get a motion in a second to adjourn? And please state your name for the record when you make the motion. Brian Kane.
Brian Kane moves to adjourn.
Is there a second? Darlene Wynn.
Darlene Wynn, second.
Thank you all. Without objection, we are adjourned. Have a great 2 weeks. We'll see you soon. Bye, guys.